Welcome back to another edition of Mr. D reading the Hope Chest. In this chapter, we're starting the beginning of chapter 2, which is the dying Mrs. Renwick. And here we find out that Violet actually runs away, and she ends up sitting on a train car next to someone named Mrs. Renwick. So here I have an image in the background of a 1920s train car. So you can sort of imagine Violet sitting in one of these seats right next to Mrs. Renwick. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy it. We'll go from about page 18 for 25 for those of you that are following along at home. Chapter 2, The Dying Mrs. Renwick. Violet wished she had more comfortable clothes to run away in. Her navy blue pleated skirt and matching sailor's midi blouse were what Mother called a compromise. Mother liked to dress Violet in fluffy white dresses with lots of petticoats, a sash and ribbons of violet satin, and a hat with artificial violets around the brim. Violet would have preferred overalls. She had seen girls' overalls advertised in the Sears Roebuck catalog, although she'd never actually seen anyone wearing them. They looked very convenient and serviceable. Violet had ruined several white dresses while exploring the muddy banks of the Susquehanna River and lost 2 hats with violets around the brim. Then Mother had given up on the white dresses and violet trim. As far as Violet was concerned, her navy blue clothes weren't a compromise at all. Violet wanted overalls. When Violet had finally gone home, after an hour or two of squatting among the trees on the bank watching the Susquehanna water slide indifferently past, she'd been sent to her room for dinner. Violet had tucked the letters into her bloomers just above the band of elastic round her knee and pulled up her stockings over them and buttoned the garters to her undervest before she got home. When Mother asked her for the letters, Violet told her she'd thrown them in the river. Now it was morning, and Violet sat on an itchy mohair-covered train seat and stared out the window at the smokestacks and the soot-blackened brick buildings as the soot-blackened brick buildings chugged by. She was on her way to New York City. She was through with Mother and Father and their rules. She was going to the Henry Street Settlement House, and she was going to find Chloe. Before she left, Chloe had told Violet about settlement houses. They were mostly started in bad neighborhoods in the big cities by young college men and women. They lived in the settlement house and did whatever they could to help out, taught English classes, took care of sick people, organized children's clubs. There were even some workers in the settlement houses who called themselves social workers, although Violet wasn't quite sure what those were. It had something to do with socialism. Socialism, Chloe had once explained to her, meant the idea that people should take care of each other instead of just themselves. Well, Violet was big enough to take care of her and whoever else needed it. She had snuck out of the house in the very first morning light, taking her savings of $3.92 tied up in a handkerchief pinned inside her midi blouse. Violet couldn't face another scene. She hated scenes, and besides, she doubted very much that she would have been able to leave if there had been a fight, since unlike Chloe, she was only 11 and didn't have the hope chest. She remembered the final scene when Chloe had left and never come back. Father and Chloe had yelled at each other at the door. Mostly Father. Mother had stood behind him saying, "Arthur, the neighbors." Violet sat at the top of the stairs out of everyone's sight. She had hugged her knees to her chest, bunched up into a tight little ball of terror, as Father's bellowing rang through the hall and made the crystal in the chandelier hum. Stephen had been in the front parlor, presumably studying the wallpaper. Violet had heard the front door slam shut and the creaking of the crank that started the hope chest, and then the sudden roar of the hope chest engine as Chloe drove away. The hope chest had been the final straw, as far as Father was concerned. Not the votes for women nonsense, not the crazy college ideas, not Chloe's insisting that she wanted to do something meaningful, but the hope chest. Granny Mayhew was Father's mother. When she died in 1914, she had left $250 each to Violet and Chloe for their hope chests, and $500 to Stephen for his education. A hope chest was a big wooden trunk that a girl was supposed to fill with the things she'd need when she was married, tablecloths and bed linens and dishes and things like that. But of course money could be a lot more useful than tablecloths. Violet tried not to think about what she would have done with that $250 if they ever really let her have it. Travel, maybe to South America. They never would, of course, not after what Chloe had done with her hope chest money. No, they'd keep it from Violet. Keep it safe from her, as Mother would say, and make her spend it to set up housekeeping with some future husband. $250 worth of furniture and linens and housekeeping stuff. The thought of it was oppressive, like high walls closing in on her, but there's nothing she could do about it. Stephen had taken his $500 and enrolled at Cornell University. A year later, he had gone off to Canada, way back in 1915, long before America entered the war. He had enlisted in the Canadian Army and had been sent to France to fight the Germans. A few Americans did that. You heard a lot in those days about martyred Belgium, and it made some people mad that America wasn't getting into the war. By the time American boys were being conscripted into the army and sent overseas in late 1917, Stephen was already back, or at least what was left of him. Chloe had somehow convinced father to let her go to college. Not a big university, like Cornell, of course, but a junior college. Violet wasn't sure how all this had been accomplished. But Chloe had always been able to talk to father more than Violet had, at least back when they were still speaking to each other. At the time, Violet was mainly concerned that Chloe was going away, although not very far, and wasn't going to sit at the foot of her bed and tell her stories every night or draw her pictures of Alaska. But then college had led to talk about the settlement houses and being a nurse, and then Chloe had taken her Hope Chest money, all of it, and bought a used Model T Ford. She even had the effrontery to name it the Hope Chest. So it was for sure that Violet wasn't ever going to get $250. She had $3.92 in a jar under her bed, and saved up from birthdays and her allowance. It was a remarkable sum, or so she'd always thought, until she bought the train ticket to New York. It had cost $3.25. She tried to buy a half-price ticket, claiming she was under 8, but the ticket clerk had told her in a bored voice that she could either be old enough to travel to New York City by herself or young enough to travel at half fare, but not both. And Violet didn't dare argue since she was nervous about the trip to New York, and besides, she wasn't really under 8. Well, Chloe would be glad that Violet was coming to live with her. Violet could go to school in New York, and Mother could devote all her time to Stephen, and Father would be positively glad Violet was gone. Mother might worry what the neighbors would think, but Father probably wouldn't even care about that. They'd both be glad. They'd gotten rid of Chloe, and now... Violet felt a tear trickle itchily down the side of her nose, and she wiped it away with her sleeve. Tickets! The conductor was coming through the car. Violet nervously held out her ticket, trying to look like she rode trains all the time. The conductor read the ticket and frowned at her. "Kind of young to be going to New York City alone, aren't you, miss?" "I'm almost 12, said Violet defensively. The conductor shrugged, punched a hole in the ticket, and handed it back to her. At the next stop, a woman got on and took the seat across from Violet. Violet could tell at once that she was a meddlesome woman. She was dressed in the fashion of 20 years ago, in a swooping black bombazine gown, and she smelled of mothballs. She was tightly corseted into a perfect S-shape, with a pigeon bosom, a wasp waist, and a bustle to exaggerate her rear end. On her head she wore a black hat with an enormous lopsided brim, 2 feet to starboard and 1.5 feet to port. Father would have said. The corpse of a large bird, dyed a dismal purple, was diving into a mass of black ribbons heaped around the crown of the hat. Involuntarily, Violet clutched at her own neat straw hat, as if the woman might try to trade with her. The woman sat down stiffly with great difficulty. She tilted her head back slightly, probably to balance her hat, and scowled down her nose at Violet. "I," she said with great emphasis, "am Mrs. Albert Renwick of Huntington, Long Island." "Pleased to meet you," Violet lied. Mother would probably have wanted Violet to stand up and curtsy. "And you," said Mrs. Renwick. "Miss Violet Mayhew of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania," Violet said. Mrs. Renwick twitched her nose suspiciously, as if she thought Violet might be making fun of her. "You're very small to be traveling alone. Where are you going?" "New York City," said Violet, thinking it was none of Mrs. Renwick's business. "And what takes you there, if I may ask?" "I'm going to visit my sister, my grown-up sister." "Young ladies," said Mrs. Renwick, "should not travel unaccompanied on the train. Is your sister married?" "No," said Violet shortly. "Then why is she not living with your parents? Are your parents still living?" "Yes," said Violet. "They're very busy with my brother Stephen. He's still recovering from the war." Violet hoped that would silence Mrs. Renwick. A recovering war veteran was a very impressive thing to have in the family. "All the more reason your sister ought to have stayed home to help. In my day, a girl's greatest joy was of being of service to her brothers. I myself worked my fingers to the bone in a glove factory to pay for my brother's tuition at Harvard, and I felt privileged to do so," Mrs. Renwick said defiantly, as if Violet had suggested she hadn't. "Privileged to do so. But I suppose your sister is one of these new women." She made it sound like it was a disease. Violet glanced around surreptitiously for another empty seat. It would be very rude to get up and walk away from Mrs. Renwick, But Mrs. Renwick was pretty rude herself. Mrs. Renwick seemed to sense what was on Violet's mind and changed the subject. "I'm dying, you know, Violet," she said. All right, and thanks for listening. We're midway through the page on 25.